This is the story of Piers Gaveston, the royal favourite whose death would shock even today's society. Welcome to my channel. Today we will be looking at the death of Piers Gaveston, a man who may have been a skilled knight, but was certainly an insufferable jerk. In 13th century England, King Edward II was known for his eccentric choices, such as choosing what to wear or how to best pleasure himself. But arguably the most peculiar choice was his beloved Piers Gaveston. You see, King Edward II loved this guy, showering him with titles, money, land, and women. And people in medieval England really did not approve of this relationship. Piers Gaveston was a Gascon knight who rose to power in England during the reign of King Edward II. His ascent was nothing short of astonishing. Within a year of meeting the monarch, Edward made him Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royalty, and granted him lands, titles, and positions of power. He also received a sizable annual pension of 400 marks. By 1306, he owned estates worth about £750,000 in today's money. The young man was living the high life. But why did Edward favour him so much? Well, we don't know exactly. It has been suggested that it might have been because of a private embarrassment suffered by the king at the hands of Gaveston during their first jousting match. Edward fell off his horse after tripping over a tree root. Some accounts say it happened because Gaveston cut the root, but that is just a legend. Still, these stories illustrate the hostile attitude towards Gascon and his close ties to the king. His close relationship with the king was a source of immense friction between the monarchy and the English nobility. Edward's nobles despised Gaveston for his arrogance, the disrespect he showed to the established hierarchy, and his alleged manipulation of the king. To make matters worse, they suspected that Gaveston's influence was corrupting the young king and leading to bad governance. The animosity reached a boiling point when Gaveston openly mocked the nobility, earning himself some truly creative insults. He taunted them by calling the powerful Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden, saying, "Good morrow, ape of Burgundy," and he called the aging Earl of Lincoln Old Hog. No wonder the barons hated him. To make matters worse, Edward's trust in Gaveston was unshakable. Despite the opposition, he continued to promote Gaveston, enraging the English nobility further. They saw this as a complete disregard for their status and a direct challenge to their authority. As tensions escalated, the barons repeatedly forced Edward to banish Gaveston from England. But each time the king found a way to bring him back. He gave Gaveston titles in Ireland and Wales, where he didn't answer to the English nobility. Edward II promised to never summon Gaveston to England again if the barons let him stay in Ireland. When the barons refused this deal, the king went back on his word and summoned Gaveston anyway. Naturally, this fueled the barons' rage and confirmed their worst fears about the king's poor judgment and inability to rule effectively. Finally, on March 13, 1312, the barons trapped Gaveston in Scarborough Castle. When Edward learned about this, he was furious and rode toward the castle to rescue his favourite. But he had barely arrived when the barons forced him to agree to terms which included sending Gaveston to London for trial on charges of treason. The barons escorted Gaveston to Warwick Castle, which was controlled by the Earl of Warwick. But Warwick broke his agreement with the king and took Gaveston from his captors. Then the barons met in a hurried court and decided to take Gaveston to London for trial. The journey began on June. Now, while the barons were transporting Gaveston to London, two figures emerged as the driving forces behind the plan to dispose of him: the Earl of Warwick and the Earl of Lancaster. Their hatred for Gaveston was palpable, and they saw this moment as their chance to get rid of him once and for all. However, another crucial figure played a significant role in sealing Gaveston's fate: Archbishop of Canterbury, who had earlier excommunicated Gaveston. This action removed any spiritual protection he might have had and made it easier for the barons to justify his murder. On June, when they reached a place known as Blacklow Hill, a spot near Warwick, the barons assembled in secret and held a meeting under the pretense of discussing hunting plans. But it was no ordinary gathering. Once the barons gathered at Blacklow Hill, they summoned Gaveston and informed him of their decision. They charged him with crimes against the kingdom and accused him of corrupting the king. In spite of his protests, they found him guilty. The sentence was swift and merciless: death by beheading. Now, before we go further, please take a moment to subscribe. It would mean a lot to us. As the men prepared to carry out the sentence, one of them hesitated. Reportedly pleading with the rest to reconsider, he reminded them that Gaveston was a royal favorite, and killing him could have dire consequences. However, his pleas fell on deaf ears. The barons were relentless, and they carried out their grim task. They dragged Gaveston to the waiting block, but his final moments were not filled with dignity. Instead, it was a public spectacle of horror. The barons mutilated him before delivering the final blow, a shocking display of brutality that underscores the raw, brutal nature of their power. What was this gruesome mutilation? We hear you asking. Well, to humiliate him further, they forced him to watch as they beheaded his servant, Roger, and then they tortured him for information about the king's movements. Now, according to some sources, his testicles were cut off before he was beheaded, an act designed to strip him of his perceived unnatural influence over the king. After all, the barons believed that their King Edward II was acting under the influence of some dark magic wielded by Gavin's son. By castrating him, they hoped to sever that unnatural bond. Some historians argue that the castration was not actually mentioned in contemporary sources and should not be considered fact. But others counter that such a graphic detail would likely have been omitted if it wasn't true. After his castration, they put him on his knees and asked him to pray. But his prayer was cut short by the final blow. The executioner's sword stroke ended his life, but not before inflicting a terrible injury. The sword severed his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. In spite of this agonizing end, his body was left by the roadside for several days before it was taken to a nearby church. Such treatment was considered a grave insult in medieval times, highlighting the depth of the barons' hatred for Gaveston. When Edward II heard the news of his favorite's murder, he was devastated. His grief was profound and immediate. It's said that he wandered around the palace in a daze, mourning the loss of a man who had become an integral part of his life. Edward blamed himself for Gaveston's death, convinced that he had somehow caused this tragedy. He was heartbroken by the thought that his actions had led to the demise of someone he loved dearly, and the barons wanted to remind the king about his favorite's death. Every time the king entered the throne room, they would have a guard walk ahead of him ringing a bell and crying, "Beware the bells of Gaveston." Can you imagine how traumatizing this must have been for the poor king? Edward was inconsolable. Even after many years, he still talked about his dear departed friend. But his grief soon turned into a desire for revenge, vowing to make the barons pay for what they had done. Unfortunately, Edward was too weak to do anything. The barons had too much power and were willing to use it against the king. So Edward's threats remained just that, empty words. The barons' brutal execution of Gaveston had far-reaching consequences. It plunged England into a period of chaos and civil unrest as the king now faced a powerful coalition of barons who had defied his authority with impunity. The murder also set a grim precedent, showing that a king's power was not absolute and that his authority could be challenged and overturned by brute force. In the aftermath of Gaveston's death, Edward II's authority was severely weakened, leading to a constitutional crisis. The barons gained the upper hand, forcing the king to sign the Barons' Letter in 1313, which significantly limited his power and asserted the dominance of the nobility in England. For a few moments, it looked like justice had prevailed over tyranny. Following his death, Edward II ordered that Gaveston's remains be recovered and given a proper burial. The remains were placed in the choir of Canterbury Cathedral, where they lay to rest. The act of vengeance was complete, but it could not undo the horror of what had transpired at Blacklow Hill. And that's all for our tales of history today. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.